Parliament Secretary Xolile George says the legislature has an obligation to restore the fire-gutted buildings in the National Assembly. George addressed members of the media earlier today, and amongst them was senior reporter Ayesha Ismail, who's now joining us live from our studios from Cape Town. Ayesha, salam. Thanks for joining us this afternoon on Today. You engaged with Mr. George a little bit earlier. The bigger question is, when will this part that was gutted by fire in Parliament be restored to its former glory?
So Dan, Xolile George says that come November 2025, he's confident that the restoration process would have been completed. He says he understands that people want to see building and restoring starting already at Parliament, but he says we have to understand the devastation that was caused by that fire, so much so that 2 billion rand has been allocated for the restoration. What's interesting is that he says that although the heritage aspects will of course be respected, there will be added features to Parliament. So come November 2025, Parliament might not look like the Parliament that we've come to know over these years. But let's listen to what Xolile George had to say to us earlier today.
As we reconstruct Parliament, we do restoration. We must also respond to space requirements of a democratic Parliament. At the same time, respond to the aspirations of South Africans. What type of Parliament they would like to see? How must it look like? How does it embody the spirit of the uniqueness of South Africa? A multicultural society, a tapestry of rich heritage that reflects the deep historical structure of our society. So those issues will be challenging questions that the reconstruction design process must seek to accommodate, to balance historical dimension of preservation, on the one hand responding to what the needs of a democratic Parliament must accommodate. At the same time, how must it look like? So we are quite excited that we'll be starting a process of detailed design. At the same time, consider inputs of South Africans, how they want to see their own Parliament look like. But we're quite pleased.
I mean, Ayesha, it seems to be taking a long time. It's a year and a half since part of Parliament went up in smoke.
So this is exactly what Xolile George also tried to explain to us. He says we must remember that when that fire started on the 2nd of January last year, it was then declared a crime scene. And of course, law enforcement agencies had to come in and do their work. After that, they needed the structural engineers to come in and do their work and then, of course, declare the area safe. And he says that Parliament was only handed back to the parliamentary authorities in March this year, and so they have started their work. They've got the Development Bank of Southern Africa overseeing the restoration process, and he says that he is confident that the work the actual restoration work will start in January next year. And as I said, and he reiterated that he's confident that it will be done by November 2025. But he also talked about Parliament's internal processes that needed to take place in terms of the investigations. So of course we know that on a criminal perspective, we had one person, namely Zandile Mafe, who was arrested and charged and who is on trial at the moment in the Western Cape High Court. But then of course there was an internal process as well, and this is what Xolile George had to say about Parliament's internal process.
Ayesha, the investigation has been completed, and we're busy internally with the due process of checking recommendations and also examining options for implementation of some of the key recommendations that spoke to policy weaknesses, governance weaknesses, and also look at areas where we may have defaulted in terms of our work. And all of those issues require a careful examination, because you would know that in any process of investigation, due process warrants both substantive and procedural issues to be balanced. And we're quite confident that very soon we will be able to communicate the findings of the investigation, and we will invite you. Weaknesses in security were also extensively identified, and we will be able to detail those. And we are now in a process of strengthening security of Parliament. We are almost at the tail end of concluding the appointment of a Chief of Security for Parliament to make sure that we stabilize the operating environment and provide much needed leadership to what was existing before a much more weakened security operations of Parliament. We're quite pleased that we have taken bold steps.
The Secretary of Parliament, Xolile George, ending that update from Ayesha Ismail in Cape Town.